Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's Health Professions Educator Series. It's so good to see everyone, albeit virtually, on this Monday morning. We are excited today to have Dr. Deramo from Virginia Tech with us to talk about teaching diverse learners, strategies for inclusive and anti-racist teaching for medical education. As our learner populations continue to become more diverse, it is so critical that we all equip ourselves with knowledge and skills to better connect and teach all types of learners. Dr. Michele Deramo is Associate Vice Provost for Diversity, Education, and Engagement in the Office for Inclusion and Diversity at Virginia Tech. Throughout the presentation, Dr. Deramo has said feel free to post any questions or comments in the chat, and we'll make sure to field those to her as we go. Or if you would prefer, please unmute or raise your hand to share. In the chat, Deb will also be sharing a session evaluation. So please take a few minutes to share your feedback. Without any further ado, I will pass things over to Dr. Deramo to get us started today.
Thank you. And hello, everybody. And hello to my friend, Dave Music, who I see is here. Dave and I are working on another project together. Mariah gave a good introduction. And so I'm just going to move ahead to the objectives. Just very quickly, we're going to begin by discussing experiences and perceptions of underrepresented minority students in higher education. Then we're going to look at identifying behaviors that might be considered problematic and describing strategies for mediating those and what to do instead. And then in the final piece, we're going to recognize some positive interventions for creating that inclusive, anti-racist classroom environment. So I want to begin first by defining some terms that I'm using to set this up. And the first is inclusive teaching or inclusive pedagogy. And what that is, very high level definition, is it's a learner-centered instructional approach. It's built on the principles of respect, inclusion, and cultural responsiveness, and the belief that all students can learn. So much of inclusive teaching, inclusive mindset really comes out of the movement for inclusion of students with disabilities into the traditional classroom. And we have since adapted that in diversity education to think of inclusion broadly. Building on inclusive pedagogy is this idea of anti-racist teaching. And anti-racist teaching has been around for a very long time, from ever since in the United States, children were segregated and Black families were trying to make sure that their children received education even when they were segregated or excluded. But we've started hearing about anti-racist teaching, and it's become more codified since 2020. And so anti-racist teaching, again, building on these ideas of a respect and inclusion and cultural responsiveness, but going a step further by making an active commitment to counteract the persistence and impact of racism and cultivating the conditions in the classroom that create constructive change. So today we're talking about inclusive teaching, and then at the very end, I'm going to really look, how do we deliberately make this not just inclusive teaching, but anti-racist as well. So let's begin then with what is the experience of being an underrepresented minority student on a predominantly white campus. Again, going to identify some terms. URM, or underrepresented minority, is a term, it's a contested term. There are people who find the term very problematic, but it is a term used by the United States Department of Education to identify and count a specific groups of students, specific demographic. And according to the US Department of Education, the group that would be considered underrepresented are domestic Black, African American, Hispanic Latinx, Native American, Alaskan Native, and Hawaiian Pacific Islander. You'll note that this definition does not include Asian beyond Hawaiian Pacific Islander. There are some campuses that are, for example, out in California, that also consider students from Vietnamese or Hmong or Filipino background is to be included in this underrepresented minority category. So this is a contested term, but basically we're talking about students who are historically not just counting in terms of numbers, but also in terms of their experiences in the history of the United States as being underrepresented. And we're not talking about underserved, but that's a different category. That typically includes first generation, veteran, low socioeconomic status. Okay, PWI, predominantly white institution. I have a colleague who says historically white institution or institutions created in their founding had the intent of preserving the white status quo. Most institutions are moving away from that legacy, but still are considered predominantly white. So this is language that it's important that we think about the cultural contexts as we move forward. Okay, so what is the experience? And I'm going to begin by talking about an essay written by LaShira Nolan. This is a photograph of her in a white lab coat in front of a Harvard Medical School pylon. In June of 2020, she wrote an essay called What I Want to Say When You Ask Me How I'm Doing. And it's an essay about being a Black woman and medical student in the often lonely world of higher education. And that is a direct quote from her essay. I want to share some excerpts from that. And I think there's lots of different content that talks about the experience of being underrepresented and a predominantly white. I want to look at Dr. Nolan's because she is a medical student and she's talking about that specific kind of experience. And she talks about that throughout her, as an undergraduate and then also as a medical student, she learned to respond to the question of how are you doing with a smile and fine, how about you? And said, and I'm going to be quoting from this article now, I try my best to focus on their words, but no matter what I do, the suffering of my community is often heavy on my mind. While I was in my classes learning how to heal my future patients, I was also learning that even the power of medicine isn't enough to quell the deadly effects of systemic racism. And because this was written in the heels of the COVID-19 lockdown, as I learned about research for a cure for COVID-19 at one of the best medical schools of the world, deep down I knew that if a cure were discovered, my family would not be able to afford it. How's it going? My professors asked. Terribly, because COVID-19 and her sister's systemic racism are ravaging my community and threatening the lives of the people I love. That's what I wanted to respond. But I didn't. And in those moments, I once again left my Black experience at the door for the sake of my professionalism as a medical student. My entire experience in higher education has involved centering my professors' and colleagues' white comfort, often at the expense of my own mental wellness. I know this is a harmful practice, but the hierarchical nature of academic medicine and white fragility don't lend themselves to safe, honest conversations about racism. And in these kinds of environments, it feels impossible to answer the question, how are you, with honesty, when you're afraid to provoke white guilt or worse, threaten or damage your academic success. And so I've learned to pick and choose my battles. She then goes on to say that by the end of May, though, this became impossible for her, that the fear and the pain and the concern about family and seeing what was going on in the world, and particularly on the heels of the George Floyd shooting, she couldn't separate them out. And so she writes, she told the truth. And she then says something remarkable happened. My professor took the time to listen to me. And she talks then about the value of that experience of sharing the truth and being heard. But then saying, you know, this needs to, I shouldn't have had to ask. There needs to be more awareness. There needs to be more understanding. And she ends her essay then with, here's what we need from you. And you, being health educators, like all of you, medical educators, to see us, to see our Blackness, to help us fight to protect it, to see us beyond DEI committees, to watch the news, to care about Black news, be outraged by Black suffering just as we are, to cry with us, to care about us. Now, the interesting thing when we look at this, what we need from you, some of it is what we have been taught to not do. You know, in many ways, we've been taught that as educators, we need to keep things professional. We need to, treat all the students the same. We need to just focus on the subject matter. But what we're hearing here is what students need. And this is Dr. Nolan's experience, but in many ways, it can be generalized to many different kinds of students, saying, we need you to understand where we come from, that we bring our whole selves, that we're going to learn better, and we're going to be better students and better professionals if that education is embedded in care. So broadly, going out beyond this one particular student, there's been research on what are the costs of balancing academics and racism. But we also know that we can exchange that with sexism or ableism, ageism, and so forth. But we're really focusing on, at this particular moment in history, racism being the most salient. What are the costs? And so research is telling us that many students, not all, but many students of color, not only have to battle institutional racism, but also stereotype threat. You know, the sense of, I'm carrying around the stereotypes of my people. What people, maybe you don't have that stereotype about me, but I don't know that. And I'm worried about it, and it's weighing on my shoulders. So I'm dealing with this in the classroom. And in addition to wanting to excel as a student, I also feel like I need to disprove these stereotypes. And oftentimes students are working themselves to the point of illness to prove their intellectual worth. We hear a lot about grit and the importance of grit. That's quality we admire. In that there's even grit researchers. Researchers study this idea of grit, working hard, pushing through, being resilient. But research is showing that higher education often requires Black students in particular to employ even more grit than their peers if they want to achieve in the classroom and out of it. And what grit research is not looking at is that toll that it takes. So students then, in addition of continually having to activate this grit to be successful, are experiencing higher levels of anxiety and trauma. So now we have a new factor entering in. Now there is the toll on mental health and mental wellness. And we also know then that students of color are less likely than their white counterparts to avail themselves of mental health resources on campus. They're less likely to undergo and to seek out psychological treatment. And some of that unwillingness to take advantage of mental health services often reflects their cultural mistrust of the institution, or perhaps not finding a cultural match to deal with something as sensitive as mental health. And so we see then how this creates this web that students are needing to navigate. And the racism, and this is a quote now, the racism that students experience on their campuses suggests that colleges and universities are systems that perpetuate their pain. So let me repeat that and let that reflect on that. The racism that students experience on their campuses suggests that colleges and universities are systems that perpetuate their view. So you're here because you want to make a difference. You've elected to come to this session, and so what do? That's the next question. So first of all, how can we, when in our own, we always have to look at what can I do within my sphere of influence. So how can I look at how I am in the classroom? What might I be doing that actually is perpetuating a negative environment? It doesn't have to be blatant. Oftentimes, sometimes it can even be these subtle actions. And what can I do differently? So what I'm going to do is I've identified, well, not just me personally, but based on the work that I've done, there's 7 problematic practices. We're going to look at each one of these. We're going to say, why are they problematic? Because obviously, when you look at these, on the surface, they don't necessarily seem like you're doing anything really bad. In fact, some of these, you know, we've always thought were good things to do. Why are they problematic? What can we do instead? And I try to give a little bit of really just concrete practice with each one of those. So let's look at those one by one. At any time, you are welcome to request clarification. I'm going to be focusing mostly, so one of the coordinators of the session will help to cue me, alert me if there is a question, but please know that you can interject. So let's look at this idea of altering expectations. So first of all, what do I mean by that? So one of the most common ways that racism or ableism or sexism can enter teaching practice is through our expectations of student ability and achievement. Now, this might be a bigger problem when we're dealing with students like pre-college. But it nonetheless, you know, pre-college sets the path for all the way into graduate and professional education. So we make it an impression. We have impression of a student based on their appearance or their gender, their race, their accent, maybe the way they're dressed, maybe the way their habits. And we form an association between that impression and maybe behaviors or characteristics and what we then expect from them, or how we interpret what we receive from them. And of course, this is what I call the bias equation, assumption plus association, which then leads to differential treatment. So altering expectations then can be tied to implicit bias. So what do we do instead? Well, of course, first, before we even get into practices, we always, you know, we check our biases. We do the process of self-reflection. We understand am I making these associations and so forth. We're going to be talking about that repeatedly. But what we can do is, in the classroom, implement practices that will reduce the influence of implicit bias. Some examples might be improving conditions for interacting with students in and beyond the classroom. So one thing we know about the science behind implicit bias is that whenever we're feeling rushed or stressed or there's lots of distractions, we are more likely to default to implicit bias or those shortcut ways of thinking. And oftentimes implicit bias is based in those shortcuts. You know, we see something, we immediately have we fill in the blanks, we immediately come to a conclusion. Now, it's when we have more time to be thoughtful that our actions and beliefs are more aligned with what we declare that we think is true. Okay, so oftentimes implicit bias is not necessarily what we would declare as this is what I believe to be true. But when we're stressed or we're tired or we're distracted, we take that shortcut. How can we create our interactions that don't, that are distraction free, that are more thoughtful. So whenever we can improve those conditions, we are going to be less likely to be influenced by implicit bias when we interact with students. And I'm going to jump to the third bullet there. That may also be that if we do have a question or we do see something that doesn't seem right, instead of just resting on this conclusion, that we get more information. So if we see a student is making a lot of errors, if we see a student who's arriving late, or a student seems to be less attentive, or they're falling asleep, instead of making an assumption of why that might be happening, we get more information. We reach out, we ask a question, we bring it up. And then getting more information helps us to come to the correct conclusion rather than one that is an assumption. And then also using those consistent and transparent methods for responding to and assessing students' work. Here are the expectations for what you will do, and here's how you get there. Another is problematic practice is being colorblind. Or another way of doing it is saying, well, I treat all students equally. I treat all students the same. Well, we think isn't that the way it should be? That and kind of inherent in that is the idea that difference, the presence of difference, is somehow divisive. So students, though, who feel like when you say something like, well, people are people, we're all human beings, I don't see race, we should be a colorblind society, or anyhow, any attitude that says, listen, I don't, circumstances don't matter, I don't care who you are, this is the way we do things. What it does is it ignores students' lived experiences. And even to outright say something like, I don't see race, is actually perceived as a microaggression. It's perceived as saying, you don't see me. So what to do instead is to adopt culturally responsive practices. Now, what does that mean? Culturally responsive practices are ones that incorporate students' cultural references into all aspects of teaching and learning. So it might be, how do we activate students' prior knowledge? What do students bring to the classroom that will be relevant to how they learn and interact with the material? How can we make the learning contextual to what students already know? How do we enable students to leverage their cultural capital in the process of interacting with the material? One thing you can do then is take inventory of your content and the sources you use. That's a great first step to being culturally responsive. Whose voices are included, whose are left out, whose perspective is given authority. Do sources include experts from various races, ethnicities, genders, and sexualities? Are images and media likewise representative of the fullness of group social diversity? So even when we think we're dealing just with facts here, how that is conveyed, how they are interpreted, in fact, can be representative of the group social. Any questions or anything at this point? I'm just moving forward here. The next problematic practice is playing devil's advocate. Now, this may not be as relevant for medical education, okay, but we all know that the people who like to do the devil advocate, like, well, I'm going to present an opposite point of view, just to, keep things interesting, just to challenge our thinking. But Marcia Chatelain, who's a professor of history at Georgetown, says that this, it's used oftentimes to show the value of both sides, okay? And to urge students to think critically about their positions and to be familiar with different perspectives. Okay, that's all fine. But it's premised on this notion that every intellectual idea has an equally rigorous opposite. And so the pedagogical limitation is that it teaches students that an issue may have a we're all equal, that there's no biological differences around something like race. Other people believe that certain races are better at certain things. Okay, so that's like a point counterpoint. Yes, these are two sides of an issue, but in fact, the impact and consequence of the ideas are completely overlooked. And it's so rather than engaging in this reckless game of devil's advocate, it's probably better to identify what's non-negotiable for debate in the discipline. Specifically, not every intellectual idea has an equally rigorous opposite, but it's more important to focus on evidence and analyze nuance, and to discuss how and why new evidence and research, in fact, render some ideas as incorrect, incomplete, or harmful. Okay, so just because some people don't believe in climate change doesn't mean that that's equally rigorous in terms of a position. Okay. Similar to that is the problematic practice of claiming objectivity that, and again, this is one I am interested in a STEM field, like in medical and health profession. This is something we're what does that mean? What does this look like? How can this be a problematic practice in STEM medical? So, and this is the idea that empirically proven facts establish indisputable universal principles. Now, Daryl Wing Su writes a lot about microaggression. He's an education professor, and he talks that in the academic protocol, it establishes standards and norms for the learning environment, and says that oftentimes this it's deeply rooted in white Western notions of science that emphasize empiricism over experience, reason and rationality over emotion, and reductionism over narrative complexity. So professors claim to present content as if it were an object that were separate and abstracted from themselves. Okay, so the idea of it's objective, that there's no emotion, there's no subject. What to do instead is what we, in the social sciences, humanities call identifier positionality. Now, what does this mean? First of all, is that we interrogate the assumption that empirically proven facts establish indisputable universal principles, and instead reflect on how the complexity of our identities and lived experiences might inform how we interpret data. So it's not saying, well, this data is wrong, or this data isn't, there's not just one way to think about data that may come out of research. That who we are, where we come from, the kind of things we deal with every day may in fact influence what that data means. And so bringing that to the forefront is another strategy for this problematic practice. Another one, obviously, avoiding real-time avoiding real-time issues, not obviously. Avoiding real-time issues ignores impact. So this is the compulsion to stay on the topic. And I'm thinking of, for example, when 9/11 happened, and how many times did students go into class, and class started and no one acknowledged this huge thing happened in the country. Okay, so there's always times where real life issues may be compelling enough that can we begin class without acknowledging that they may impact students, differently. Okay, so what to do instead is, of course, to pause to acknowledge. and to recognize that students do come to the class with their whole life selves. And if we fail to acknowledge events that deeply impact the communities from which our students come, that we are missing an opportunity to model support in a space where we have power. So this is something we, of course, we need to gauge. If you're, teaching in a community where a shooting just happened, that probably needs to be acknowledged before the class begins. Maybe it's a major world event that happened and everyone's talking and thinking about it. Maybe if you have international students in your class and you know that something's happening, you have an Ukrainian student who right now is impacted by the war that's going on, or a Russian student for that matter. So this is an example of what we mean, that our compulsion is to stay focused on, there's too much to cover. We need to keep moving forward, but actually avoiding real-time issues can ignore how our students are experiencing the world and what that means when they come to the classroom. This is where I meant by obviously leaving microaggressions unchallenged is perceived as tacit approval. Microaggressions or a stereotypical statement, something that is clearly some people are going to feel offended by, or something that's not quite right that a student says, and maybe it's said in innocence, maybe it is not said in innocence. What we do instead is promptly address the issue when it arises. Oftentimes, folks in classrooms, they're just, first of all, it's one of these things where it happens quickly, and maybe you're just stunned, or maybe you don't have the tools. I don't know what to do. And so the easiest thing to do is to just keep going. In fact, students notice that you have kept going. And I have heard students, underrepresented students say, we want and need our faculty to say something. We don't want to have to be the ones who raise our hand and say, hey, that's a problem. We need our professors to be the ones. So how do you do that? How do we do that? And this is where I find a lot of people really struggle. Fortunately, some colleagues have come up with something they call You Take Action. And this little acronym gives us a script, words and tools to how to intervene when something comes up that is problematic. So begin A, ask clarifying questions, okay? So that to help you understand intention. So I want to make sure that I understood what you were saying. Were you saying that, ... So ask clarifying questions. Carefully listen. Is it in fact someone maybe didn't express themselves well and maybe would benefit, say, well, did you mean this? Or are they using the statement to code something else that needs to be addressed? The next, tell others what you observed in a factual manner. I noticed that. When I heard that, this is what I noticed. The other is impact exploration, or inquire. What do you think people think when they hear this type of comment? Okay, invite the students as a whole to think more about what's being said. Own your own thoughts and feelings around impact. When I hear your comment, this is what I think, or this is what I feel. Again, of course, also using the I language as opposed to you, or like accusatory language, using the I language. And then finally, next steps. What needs to be done? Request appropriate action. Of course, that appropriate action is determined by what was said, the conversation, that clarifying conversation that followed. One example is our class is a learning community. Such comments make it difficult for us to focus on learning because some students feel offended. So I'm going to ask you to refrain from such comments in the future. Can you do that, please? Keeping things in a particular, or it might be I think we need to talk about this a little further, or I suggest that we all do this so that we can learn more about this. So there could be a number of, but the point is next steps that something is said, you ask clarifying questions, you listen, you use I statements to describe the response and potential impact, and then there's next steps. You don't let it lie. And the final one is what I call privileging whiteness. And what I like to do here is actually share one of my own experiences when I recognized that I had brought this into the classroom, that I was privileging certain kinds of students and their behaviors over others, and why it actually can penalize students if we don't pay attention. So many years ago, probably like 20 years ago, I was teaching in a class where students were developing a project, and the class was predominantly young white women, first-year students. There were a few guys, and there were 3 Black women, and the guys were all white guys. So the young women were definitely the ones setting the tone for the class. They were very enthusiastic. They smiled a lot. They talked a lot. And without paying attention, I was attributing academic qualities to those behaviors. So the students turned in a proposal for their project, and I gave a preliminary grade. And a lot of them, I was just handing out the A's. One Black student shared her project, which involved going and mentoring children from the community where she came from. But this is a good project, but I gave her a B. Why? I don't know that, first of all, it was a while ago, but second of all, I think, why did I give her a B? Well, because probably I was using those implicit biases of cheerfulness and talking a lot in class and really kind of building this classroom community. Probably I was favoring those without really paying attention to it. This student came to me and she asked, why did I not give her a grade as high as these other students in the class? And the fact is, I really did not have a good answer for why I did not grade her as well as the other students. And it forced me to reckon with biases that I had brought in, biases that were based on privileging whiteness. So what do we do when we recognize that we've done something like this? When we've done something that advantages certain students, not because of the course mission, but because of these other qualities. And what we do is we need to embrace cultural humility. Now, what is that? Cultural humility is really the willingness to examine your practices. The willingness to recognize, you know what, I didn't do something right, or you know what, I need to learn more. And when the first thing to do when we embrace cultural humility, when students come to us and say, we need more from you, we need you to do better, is we thank them for raising that concern. Thanking rather than apologizing. And this is why. When we apologize, say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't know, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes we're actually placing the burden back on the student. When we thank them, we're saying, you know what? We're in this together. I appreciate you helping me to learn more. And this is what I'm going to do now, based on what you've said. I'm going to think about how I did this. And what I learned to do differently was I learned that I needed to do a better job of aligning my practices and assessment methods with content objectives. This was a very highly subjective type of course. And so it'd be really easy to be influenced by impressions to students that seem more likable or students who are more like me. I'm gonna reward them better. I had to do extra work to make sure I didn't fall into that trap. And if I said, here's the objectives of the course, here's how I'm going to measure them. I'm going to stay mission focused. And that's what I need to do. So these are the problematic practices. Have you identified other problematic practices? I'm going to take a pause and ask, do you have any questions about any of these? Does any of it resonate with you? Or is there anything that maybe you've seen as problematic that I've not included here?
I think there's a question in the chat, Mariah, from Dr. Unwin.
Yes, I see that. I was going to let people react to the question first and then bring that one up. But if nobody has any thoughts there, we can jump into the question in the chat. So Dr. Unwin asks, do you recommend that the faculty member go through all the action steps publicly with the entire group, or as an alternative, make some sort of statement and conduct the action conversation in private with the student?
That's a good question. So, excuse me. I think that, first of all, I think for all of this, I can't ever give a absolute response. I think you do kind of have to judge the climate, who the individual student is. I think that as in any kind of typology, we adapt it for the circumstances. So going through each of these steps may not be appropriate to do live in class. I think you would at least want to do the first and second one. You know, what did you mean? Or can you clarify what did I hear you correctly? And based on what you heard from the student in the kind of after the clarifying question, deciding what the next action is. So the next action might be, let's talk about this more offline. Okay. And then after class, following up with that student. Or it might be, let's pursue this a little further. Sometimes other students in the class will come forward. Depends on the class, depends on the student. So I guess my response is, definitely you want to do something. And the first is always ask that clarifying question and then listen to what the student responds. How you navigate the rest of the steps then depends on the context.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Are there any other questions or comments? Feel free to type something in the chat, or you can unmute, raise your hand.
We can move forward and you can continue to think, and there'll be another spot for questions. And this is, I want to move into what I'm calling the positive interventions, is moving towards that anti-racist learning environment. And again, you know, it's that deliberate decision on the part, and you may not want to, may not be at the place where you're going to make that decision, but this is moving to that next, where I'm going to make this a classroom that creates the conditions for ending racism. Which begins then with asking the question, what is race? Okay. So sometimes we say, well, race is a social construction. It's not real. I remember the first time I heard that, I'm there, how can race not be real? How can we just not see it? And because the fact is that for many people, race very much defines their lived experience, how they move through the world. It also had very much about how they identify, that people are attached to that community, where they have that shared quality. So what is race? And what do we mean by it's a social construction? there's an article, and I'm going to share the reference with you at the very end. And I encourage you to, if you're really wanting to move to an anti-racist classroom, I would strongly encourage you to read it. And it's coming out of the RaceWorks project in Stanford. But I'm going to read a few excerpts from it. One is, people often think that race is a thing, or, and this is important, an essential characteristic that people have or are. Okay, so we're thinking of the being, the idea of being in essence. And it works that people start referring to another group in a way that portrays them as inherently deficient, inferior, or lesser in some ways. Okay, so whenever we say something like, you know, all Asians are bad drivers, or, you know, all Blacks are slow and always late to meetings, etc., things like that, you're talking in terms of essence, character, inherent characteristics. And that's what's not true. That's when we talk about it's made up, that's what we mean. Next comes the inference that those people are lesser because of their biological or cultural makeup, that their ancestry, their DNA, their blood, whatever, it's fundamentally different and cannot be changed. So here's what, once again, we're taking things that are about who a person is biologically or culturally and attaching it to behaviors or ways of being. And it's this view of race as a thing that fuels institutions, laws, and policies that can then justify the past or current oppression of so-called inferior groups. Things like slavery, Jim Crow laws, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Indian Removal Act, Japanese internment, Mexican repatriation, etc. Those are all laws and policies that are outcomes of thinking that race is a thing, that race is a way of being. But in fact, and we know that all of those, of course, have multi-generational impacts. Okay, even after we overturn Jim Crow law, the impact reverberates across generations. Okay, so there's a large body of interdisciplinary research, though, over decades, that it's more important, it's better, more effective to think of race as a doing. Okay, race is something we do. It's not racial differences and racial disparities are not caused by essential characteristics, such as biology or culture, but rather because people are situated differently in society, that they have different kinds of experiences because of that, different kinds of social interactions, and it's our differing experiences that shape us into diverse kinds of people with varying backgrounds, perspectives, and lived experiences. So we do race through our everyday actions and activities, but these doing is motivated by unspoken and often deeply felt assumptions about who counts, who we trust, who we care about, who we should include, and why. And so this is how race is socially constructed. It's not just about skin color, hair texture, body shape, you know, what you look like, or things like that. So we all participate in doing race. Now let's break this down. Individual, interactional, institutional, ideological. Individual level, we do race through our biases, stereotypes, feelings, attitudes. Okay, the example I have raised, I was doing race in that class when I valued certain students' ideas over others, even though when I stepped back and applied criteria, the student that I disadvantaged actually had a better project. Okay, so individually, we do race through our biases and stereotypes. Interactional, we do race by how we interact with other people and also how we interact with media, messaging that we receive in the world. Advertisements, how we interact with that is another way that we do race. Institutionally, through schools, law enforcement, financial institutions, the medical establishment is institutionally how we do race. And then ideologically are those kind of broad sort of amorphic narratives about race and racial difference. So we're all participating in race all the time through each of those levels. So the first thing we need to do is really build our racial literacy, better understand what it is, how it operates in society, how deeply embedded it is, how invisible it can be. Once we build our racial literacy, we then discover the power for how to undo racism. Okay, there's 3 points that we want to talk about here. One is we recognize that we all have a shared history. So those of you who are affiliated with Virginia Tech, you know that we are celebrating our sesquicentennial. A very important part of the sesquicentennial celebrations of Virginia Tech have centered on telling the full story of who we are and where we come from. That historically, we've told a story about Virginia Tech. You know, the student who walked, we the land grant story, the farm student who walked many miles to come to campus, the military school. But there are also aspects of our history that we have not told. And so, yet we're all a part of the same history. We just have different ways of experience and telling it. So telling that and recognizing our shared history is one way that we can undo racism. It's sort of like a precursor. The next is taking responsibility for our role in perpetuating racism. So we talked about the problematic practices. Are there things that we do? Are there things that we advance, ideas that we advance, beliefs that we hold on to, things that, you know, traditions we don't want to give up, but that in fact do harm to certain people? So what's our responsibility for how we may do racism and allow it to continue? And then finally, learning to talk about it. Because as long as we avoid it, as long as we change the subject, it's going to continue. We need to become comfortable with looking at the questions, having the conversation. Now, one way to do that, of course, is by learning more. So one of the things that came up, and this was after George Floyd. So if you're familiar with JSTOR, they have something they call the Syllabus Project. And whenever there is something happening in the world, they create a syllabus around it. So after George Floyd, they created the institutionalized racism syllabus. They also created the Charlottesville syllabus after the event in Charlottesville, when they wanted to take down the statue and of the civil rights, or not civil rights, but Civil War person. And anyhow, I looked at the institutionalized racism syllabus, and I thought there were 4 articles in there that were of particular interest to people in medical and health professions. Okay, each of these are about doing race, but specifically doing race in health and medicine. So there was an article about the Flexner report. There was an article about the Tuskegee experiment and the lasting impact of that. There was an article about health insurance and its intersections with race. And then, of course, an article about COVID-19 and the differential impacts in Black and poor communities. So we learn more about how race is operated in history, but we also learn more about how we do race in our own spheres. And in your case, it would be in medical education, health professions. We also want to always apply the lens of intersectionality. So what we have here is the definition of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, who defined the idea It's the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, which creates overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So that's a very academic. An easy way to think about it is that we are made up of many identities. Some are more salient than others, but we don't experience the world as just a woman or just a Black person or just a gay person, but rather all of these identities, so that there are unique experiences, unique forms of discrimination that a poor white man from Appalachia may experience as compared to an older Muslim man or woman or a Black woman who is disabled, etc. That these different categorizations of identity inform how we experience the world. So, and create unique forms of discrimination and disadvantage. So we always apply the lens of intersectionality, especially like last week, I was on a panel as someone who is absolutely not an expert in it, but on a panel on Black maternal health. And so they were talking about maternal health and the unique ways, or the ways that Black maternal health is unique as compared to other forms of maternal health, other people who are having babies and experiencing maternity. Applying that lens of intersectionality. And then asking yourself these questions before you move. How have my experiences shaped my perspectives and biases? So we really need to understand, where do we come from? What's the messaging that each of us have heard over time, whether it be starting back from our families, where we come from, the communities that we each come from. And how does that impact us now? How does it hang around, even if we may have left or gone somewhere else, absorb new ideas? How does the accumulation of our experiences shape how we think and what we believe? Have I learned enough to confidently support this conversation? And if your answer is no, then the action is to continue to learn more. Okay. Have I learned enough? How can I continue to learn more? How will I handle challenging scenarios? So earlier on, I talked about the take action strategy for dealing with microaggressions. I can assure you there will be times that strategy will not work, that you will get more pushback. How do you handle it? We need to become fluent, or at least build enough competencies that we're going to be navigating. We're going to be going into territories where even our best strategies may not work. And we need to figure out how to respond. And then finally, am I truly ready to do this work, even when it becomes uncomfortable? Really doing that self-preparation. Now, I have a feeling that we need to come to a conclusion here. So I'm going to go right to our want to learn more slide and ask, are there any questions?
And I recognize we're almost at the hour, everyone. So feel free to jump off if you have to get to another meeting, or feel free to stay on with Dr. Deramo. I'm sure she would be happy to answer questions in the next couple of minutes. Or you can email us and we'll pass any questions along. The slide deck will be posted on the Teach website with Dr. Deramo's permission, so that those resources will be available to you guys there. So probably within the next couple of days.
Yeah, so there was a lot of content, so I'm providing you with some of the articles that I use. And also, if you want to do more, know more, we have some online self-paced courses. Yeah. Thank you all for your attention. All right.
Yeah, one question in the chat from Dr. Mulliner. Are there any recorded scenarios that would demonstrate some of these skills?
There are, and I'm trying to think, I don't have any in the courses that I have shared with you, but that is something we've received or that we've had requested quite often. And so that's something that we'll look for, but yeah, to see it modeled is very helpful. One thing I do have, so I do have a course on handling difficult conversations, okay? And what we do is we provide a lot of scenarios that, you know, and different ways to respond. And that oftentimes there's multiple ways to respond. And what you want to do is find what's the most inclusive, what's the most effective way to respond, and why some might be more problematic to others. So I have scenarios. I think what I'm hearing is how can we actually watch it? And that's something I'll be looking out for, so I can provide that.
All right, if there's no further questions, I think we can wrap things up for the day. Thank you so much, Dr. Deramo, for this wonderful presentation and sharing your experiences, and lots of really enjoyed. Thank you so very much coming through on the chat. And we will make sure to send you your evaluation feedback shortly as well. So please make sure that you guys fill out an CME evaluation. The link has been posted in the chat by Deb, and have a wonderful rest of your Monday. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.